I can be completely open to consider the merits of other views because I know how to think about those issues. I know where the pitfalls are in those issues, and I understand the good reasons that we have for Christianity. So these other things don't scare me. I don't have to be so frightened about hearing something that I've got to close my mind to other options.
Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This is where I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence, showing how our worldview changes everything. I hope you enjoy today's episode with my guest, Greg Koukl. Greg is the founder and president of Stand to Reason. He's spoken on dozens of college and university campuses about the truth of Christianity. He's spoken at Summit Ministries dozens and dozens of times over the years. He is an award-winning writer and best-selling author who's written several books, including one that we'll talk about today called Tactics, another one, absolute runaway bestseller called The Story of Reality, and the latest book, which helps you and me figure out how to ask questions that lead people to the truth. It's called Street Smarts. Now, Greg's received degrees from the Talbot School of Theology, from the Simon Greenleaf University, and is an adjunct professor at Biola University. Please welcome Greg Koukl to the show. Greg Koukl, welcome back to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Man, it is so great to be with you again, Jeff. I love working with Summit. I think this week we got more of our people over there. I was there a few weeks ago. It's always great to make a contribution to the great work you're doing there.
Yes, and when you say your people, you're talking about the organization that you started called Stand to Reason.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got Stand to Reason speakers who are represented at every single session of Summit Ministries.
Yeah.
We have had Alan Schliemann here and his wife Jennifer for quite a bit of the summer, which we've been really grateful for. John Noyes. And then, of course, a lot of people also who aren't part of Stand to Reason now, but who you trained over the years.
Yeah, it's great to have that impact with you guys all down the years, right?
Yeah, it has just been a huge impact over the last couple of decades, and I'm really grateful. I do tell people, and I told you this when we did a podcast before, the two of us, that the book Tactics is the best-selling book in the Summit Ministries bookstore.
Mm-hmm. Glad to hear that.
In fact, I signed a copy for you. No, I'm just kidding. I did. I had a student come up. He had my 3 textbooks, and he had Tactics on top. I was like, put that on the bottom.
Well, my rule is somebody hands me a Bible and wants me to sign their Bible. I said, look, I don't sign a book I didn't write. That's my rule. So,
well, the book Tactics, I thought, I'm not sure how this could be improved on or added to, but you've actually done it with a new book called Street Smarts.
Right.
That we have the opportunity to talk about today. And this is going to be so helpful and practical. If you're listening or watching and you ever have any conversations about anything related to a Christian worldview with people who are shaky or who don't believe it, this is a conversation you're really going to want to listen to and participate in, because Greg Koukl is the master of all of this. And he's done a call-in radio talk show for years. That's a really risky environment because you have no idea what people are going to say and how they're going to interact with you. And it's all live. If you mess it up, the risk is right there out in front of tens of thousands of people.
No safety net.
No safety net at all, except for a 5-second delay. So this is really perfect. I'd love to begin by talking about street smarts. Explain that term for somebody who wasn't a person of the streets growing up, so to speak, and then talk about how it adds to what people might have learned from Tactics, because I have a feeling that quite a few people who are watching or listening right now already have that on their shelf.
Right. Well, the street, the way I'm characterizing it, is any place where you feel uncomfortable, okay? Particularly as a Christian, engaging in the things that you are convinced of regarding the world, the Christian worldview. So this might be your family. This might be a place where you work. It could be college professors or other students that you're around. And more, being in the culture right now, Jeff, you know this. This is what you're training your students to deal with. The culture is getting so hostile, and it's difficult to, in those circumstances I just described, to stand tall and firm and effectively, persuasively for the cause of Christ. Okay, so I mean, most people are not going to go to an atheist club meeting or join an LGBT parade for the sake of evangelism. It's just too scary for them. They're not equipped to do that, and it's not just those more extreme examples, but just the general things that I was talking about. It's dangerous out there. Okay, that's the street where you just feel in danger. However, there's certain people who don't. Speaking of the street specifically, certain people who aren't frightened of doing that. These are people who are packing, or people who know how to handle themselves physically, or whatever. The point is, they're prepared, so they're not afraid. All right, and this is the kind of thing that street smarts is meant to do. It's to give our Christian brothers and sisters the wherewithal, the information, the tactical maneuvering that allows them to manage well in the street, so they don't have to be frightened of the street. They are street smart. Now, you mentioned the kinship between this book and the tactics book, and yes, they're related. In the first part of the tactics book, I talk about the game plan. I unfold the three-step game plan, which employs questions, which is why I call it the Columbo tactic, because of the iconic Lieutenant Columbo from TV fame, who used questions to maneuver and get the bad guy, basically, in his murder investigations. In our case, we're not trying to get the bad guy, we're trying to get the bad idea. And we're trying to route that out, but we're doing it in a cagey fashion. And so there's a three-step process to doing that. The second half of the book, actually the bulk of the tactics book, I'm talking about particular maneuvers that help you to identify a flaw in somebody's thinking, okay? In the case of street smarts, I do cover the tactical game plan there, so people who didn't read tactics can get up to speed quickly, although I think there's an advantage of reading the tactics book first. Nevertheless, you can start with street smarts, and I have an expanded, I have a whole chapter which is expanded from tactics on the whole concept of gardening versus harvesting. And this can be, just this alone can be life-changing for people who have grown up with an evangelistic model where you're always trying to close the deal, to get people to pray to receive Christ. And I think in most cases, that's just not the appropriate approach, okay? Maybe controversial to some people, but the fact is there are no altar calls in the New Testament, and there are no invitations to receive Jesus as Lord and Savior. The method was different. A lot of what I call gardening, not the emphasis on harvesting. And so the problem is we haven't been given gardening tools, and the tactical game plan allows that. But then you got a problem, because the first step of the game plan is to gather information. The second one, in other words, what the person believes. The second step is to figure out why they believe what they believe. Notice that in both cases, you're not advancing your own view. The third step is to use questions to either parry a challenge to Christianity or to exploit or expose a weakness or a flaw in somebody else's view. That is the thrust of street smarts, okay? And what's different in the street smarts rather than the tactics book is, rather than just explain the third step and give some examples, I go through a number of different issues, like atheism, 2 chapters on that, chapter on the problem of evil, 2 chapters on abortion, chapter on the Bible and science, a chapter on biblical difficulties like slavery, for example, or the alleged genocide in scriptures. That's a problem for people as they read that. I've got a chapter on marriage and gender and sex. So all the controversial issues, the person of Jesus being the only way, that's offensive. Is he God or the Son of God? I deal with all of these things as topics in different chapters in the book. But here's how it works together. If you're going to use say questions, and subtitle here, using questions to answer Christianity's toughest challenges, you're going to have to know what the flaw is in the challenge you hear, or the assault on Christianity that somebody is offering you. You got to know what's wrong with it. And then you have to know the steps that you take in conversation to get to the conclusion you want to get to. Plus, you got to know the questions to ask, because this is a question-asking technique. So that's the speed bump with the third use of Columbo.
Yeah.
And that's the speed bump I resolve in this book.
This
There's
is great.
lots of detail there.
Yeah, great overview. That's really helpful, Greg. So we're talking to Greg Koukl. This is a new book called Street Smarts. And if you ever have conversations with people about today's tough issues, this is something you're going to want to look at, because you can learn how to ask questions rather than just make assertions.
Right.
Greg, I wanted to affirm this approach. I can't remember if we've talked about some of the polling that we've done at Summit Ministries, but we kept noticing that 70% of the people in America, typically 65, 70%, would essentially agree with traditional values when we asked them questions. And so we're wondering, if that's really so, why isn't anybody talking? In one of our polls, we asked that question: do you ever say anything about what you believe? 40% of the people who say they have what would be a biblical belief say that they never say anything. 40%. They never say anything. So we asked them why not. And there were 3 reasons that emerged. The first one is they said, I'm afraid that I will be canceled. The second reason is they said, I do not want to give offense. And the third reason is, I don't know what to say. So this new book covers all 3 of those things. If you're in that 40% who said, I'm not ready to engage, that person threw something my way in the break room and I just ducked because I just don't want to get into this. I know that people will, they might think less of me. They might say, they might act all tolerant, but inside they're going, this person's a crazy Christian. We should, try to avoid them if possible.
Yeah. There's just one qualification. I can't guarantee somebody won't be canceled one way or another by standing for Christ. But what I can guarantee is in this book, they're going to get those other 2 elements in spades, so to speak, so they will have something meaningful to say. Obviously, our view has never been popular, ever. But now in our culture, it's more unpopular than it ever has been. Okay. And so, being able to navigate in those circumstances is absolutely critical. I start out the book by making an admission. It's the first line of the book. And I say, let's see, I've been looking for my first line. That's J. Warner Wallace's introduction. I have a confession to make. Evangelism is hard for me. All right. Yeah. Now, people don't expect me to say that because of what I do and what I write. But I'm acknowledging the difficulty it is to engage in a culture that's hostile to Christianity, okay? And by the way, it was also hard for the early Christians and even for the disciples. If you look in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is sending his disciples out in their first missionary journey, right? The kind of short-term deal. And he says within three times within 7 sentences, he says, do not fear. Do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. He has different characterizations of each time. But why did he say that? Because there's something to be afraid of. He understands that. And now he gives 2 antidotes, one explicitly, the other implicitly. Explicitly, he says the Holy Spirit is with you, okay? That's one thing. But notice here implicitly, he did not say this at the beginning of his ministry with these men. He said that well into his training. At the beginning, he said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And so there are 2 things involved here. There's a training process and then a trust in the Spirit while you execute with what you know. Okay. So my goal in this book is to provide the training in the specific area of dealing with challenges that we face in our culture right now, so that when they go out in trust with the Holy Spirit, they have an arsenal, so to speak. It's a military metaphor. Maybe that's not the best one, but they have tools. How about that? Gardening tools that will help them to navigate and to manage these tough questions in a very conversational way, in a way that really gets people thinking. Let's put it that way. Yeah. That's what I'm after too. Put a stone in their shoe. You know that one.
I know that we use that all of the time. And I thank you for letting us borrow it without attribution.
That's all right. No footnote needed.
So let's dive in. Let's just tackle one of the topics. Are you okay if I just pick any one of them from the book?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Wherever you want to go.
All right. I was visiting with a student the other day, and the question came up that that you address in this book, and I talk about in my book, Understanding the Faith. But isn't the God of the Old Testament anti-woman, anti-gay, and pro-slavery? Mm-hmm. Isn't the God of the Old Testament must be a different God? Either that or he changed his plans along the way or something, because how could a good God ever, issue the commands that he issues in the Old Testament?
Right.
So let's take that. That's one of the topics you cover.
Okay, so let me role play this a little bit here, because what you've done here is you've taken kind of a shotgun approach. You just offered like about 8 different things,
At least.
And this is the way it comes across a lot of times. And so what my approach is to try to deal with one thing at a time, okay? Because you can't deal with them all. In fact, when you hit with all of those, you feel like overwhelmed and don't even know where to start. So I'm just going to be in role play with Jeff, the critic, the concerned critic, because I think these are all fair things to raise. And Jeff, you said a lot of stuff there. I'm not even sure where to start. Why don't you start with the one that is the biggest thing, the largest concern to you right now?
Yeah. Well, I think it's, the things in Scripture where God says, go kill them all, man, woman, child, animal. That seems to bear very poorly on the idea of a loving God.
Okay, yeah, right. Okay, I got it now. And thanks for that clarification, which I'm just doing an aside here for a second. That's the first step of the game plan, is to get clarification. What do you mean by that? And so we settled in and we got some clarification. So Jeff, did you ever read the sports page?
I haven't actually read a real paper newspaper for a while.
Okay.
It comes every Wednesday. It comes every Wednesday, and I mainly use it for kindling.
Right, gotcha. Okay, we're going to put you in character like another guy that actually reads these things. So you read, when it says like the Cardinals absolutely stomped the Cubs, or they ate them alive, or what, do you think there's like mass carnage going on in a situation like that?
Yeah, I sense when I see those headlines that they're being hyperbolic. Yes.
Yes, that's right. There's an exaggeration. It's part of the style. It turns out that in the Old Testament writing, particularly with warfare records and stuff like that, you have the same thing, the military hyperbole. And so this is where I think a lot of people misunderstand. They read statements like that without realizing that God isn't talking about slitting the throat of every infant in the village. He is talking about completely defeating them, all right? Now, there may be, you see the difference right there? Okay.
That is a difference.
Okay, so that's important. Second thing is, why was God doing this? So let me ask you a question. Let's say you found out that down the road from where you live in Manitou Springs, there was a actually religious cult that was abusing children sexually. And then when they were done abusing children sexually, then they would murder the children. What do you think should be done about that? Would that bother you? I mean, it's a rhetorical question, obviously, but...
Well, the police should be called as quickly as possible. Child services should be called as quickly as possible.
Okay.
Somebody's got to rescue those kids.
Uh-huh. Would you be tempted to think maybe how could God allow such a thing if there really was a God?
Yes. Well, you would, every time a kid gets hurt, I think that just seems unfair because they're innocent.
Okay, just to give you some insight in what was going on in the ancient Near East, this is exactly the kind of thing those people in Canaan did with their children. They were religious people who took their children, they used them sexually in many different cases, and they also sacrificed their children to their gods, living sacrifice, okay? If there was a God, do you think it would be appropriate for him to act in a circumstance like that?
Yeah, I would hope that he would.
Okay, so that's what we're facing. So now what I've done here, and I give the ramp up for the dialogues in the book, but notice how we just get going. I'm using questions to have a conversation with you to help you see these events in a little different light. And by the way, that's just about the most difficult circumstance, objection, challenge that we have to face, and it's more difficult rather than the so-called slavery issue, and abortion and atheism and all the rest. But the goal is to help people have an insight into ancient Near Eastern culture, which helps them to understand why God might have stepped in to not only bring punishment to those people for years and years, indeed centuries of doing these kinds of things, but also to push them out of the land and destroy all remnants of this pagan, awful, disgusting, abusive pagan religion, so that the people who are supposed to represent the true God and bring salvation to the world would not be infected by that religion. And that's that's the dynamic that you see going on there in the conquest.
Yeah. Well, that's so good, because even as we're talking through the conversation, other directions you can go with it would be, when you say God is loving, what does a loving person do? Does that mean always just affirming what people say, going along with it? Or is there ever a situation in which love requires some kind of an action?
That's right.
So a lot of different ways you can approach that by asking questions.
Yeah. So one question, even when people say God is loving, well, why would you think God is loving? Well, he's good, isn't he? Yeah, he's good. Well, therefore he'd be loving. Right. Okay. But then why would he be so angry? Why is he doing this punishment, hell, and all that? I'll tell you why. Because he's good. He is good. And because he's good, he can't wink at evil. He can't just let it go. So the same thing that informs his love also informs his justice and the punishment of those who do evil. He doesn't let people get away with evil things. There's a sense in which a lot of times people have intuitions about these things, Jeff, that we can trade on. I call it the inside-out tactic in the tactics book. God has built some things on the inside of us that come out in our conversation. Our rage at injustice, for example. Okay, somebody ought to do something. How could they get away with that? Well, we can trade on that when we talk about God judging evil in the world. Okay, it's not inconsistent with love. It's consistent with goodness. And actually, if people say, how is hell an example of God's love? My response is, hell isn't an example of God's love. It's an example of his justice. The cross is an example of his love so that you can avoid the justice that's due you.
Yeah, this is so good. Let's kind of back up to a 30,000-foot level here.
Okay.
People are going to want to read the book, and they're going to look at how you use questions with each one of these topics. But there are always situations that catch us off guard. I remember Stephanie and I were on an airplane, and we were talking to a guy sitting next to us, and Stephanie was reading an article about the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And he said, "Can I take a look at that for a minute?" And so he read the article and then handed it back without comment. And she asked him, what did you think about it? And in the course of the discussion, he said, "Well, I'm a liberal, so I'm pro-abortion," which is sort of a strange way to state it. But then Stephanie asked, a couple of probing questions, and his response was, "Well, you know what? I think ultimately I'm in favor of abortion because I wish I had been aborted. My life has been terrible, and I wish I'd been aborted. Whoever brought me into this world was cruel." Okay, so where do you go with that? There are those kinds of situations where you think that was a curveball. I wasn't really prepared to take a swing at that. What do you do in those kinds of situations?
So, in that situation, my impulse always is to ask a question. Now, it isn't what I always do because I have a bigger impulse to talk, and lecture. And I know that a lot of people are like me, but my tactical approach is to always ask questions. And so now, in this situation, the morality of abortion it's not on the table. He's talking about something else. He's had an awful life. He's had a terrible life or whatever, and he wished that he had never been born is what he's talking about. So now you're dealing with something entirely different. And this is where it's appropriate to ask the question, and this is, the lead question, some form of, what do you mean by that? In this case, it would be, tell me about your life. What happened? Why was it so bad? And be a sympathetic listener, which I'm sure your wife would be. And any Christian, actually, who hears that. I was sitting next to a guy named John on an airplane, and I talk about it a little bit in the Street Smarts book. And he tells me he's not a Christian, which is good information for me to have. And then he says he used to be a Christian. Oh, well, that's good information for me to have. You know, how it's going to alter my approach now when I hear that. Then he said he used to be a preacher's kid. I said, John, how could you used to be a preacher's kid? Did your dad die? He goes, no, my dad didn't die. He's just not a preacher anymore. Oh, okay, I get it. And then he says he's not a Christian anymore either. Oh, man, now I know there's some baggage sitting here. So I just drew him out and I let him talk. And what he said at the end, he had a lot of bad experiences, obviously, but I just let him talk. And he said, you know, people like you, Christians, are normally going to be really mad at me right now based on what I said. But, he said, you're not mad at me. And I really appreciate that. That's what he said. Now, that alone, it seems to me, could have been a stone in his shoe. That I wasn't getting defensive on behalf of the body of Christ. I mean, Christians can be real jerks, you know, and there's a lot of people who claim to be Christian who mess up other people's lives major league. Okay, I get that, okay? The church is, some people say, well, the church is filled with hypocrites. I said, listen, the church is filled with a lot worse than that. That's why they need forgiveness and they need to get straightened out, you know. But nevertheless, there's wreckage that is left behind. And in my case, I just tried to listen to him. And in the case of the person that you're talking about, same thing. And that may open up a whole nother avenue for the idea of redemption, a life that's bad that can be turned around because of Christ that's in it. The people that hurt you in your life, whoever this man is, I'm so sorry to hear that. It shouldn't have been that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. And there's somebody who can fix it. And his name is Jesus of Nazareth. I don't know. I'm just kind of role-playing a little bit but it's not about abortion anymore. It's about his miserable life and how he wishes he were dead kind of thing or had never been born. So you're right. That is a curveball. And the best principle to follow when you get a curveball is to ask a question, especially a clarification question. What it does is it throws the ball right away into the other person's court. It invites dialogue. It's showing an interest in the other person, and it gets you off the hot seat for the moment so you can do a little thinking about how you want to proceed.
Yeah. And some of those clarifying questions can be things like, hey, tell me more about that. Or tell me, when you use that term, how you're defining it. Those sorts of questions you can ask without any judgment of any kind.
That's correct.
Just clarifying what's happening.
That's right. And a lot of times when there's a kind of a thrust at Christianity in some sense, you can parry it with a question. I remember a student asked me at Summit a number of years ago, I have a friend who said everything's relative. So how do I answer that argument? I said, well, it's not an argument. It's just a claim. But here's what you do. Ask him what he means by relative. There's our tactical game plan. Okay, now I wrote a book on relativism, so I know what it means. But I don't know that the person who says everything's relative knows what relativism is. So let them explain what they mean by everything's relative. Plus, there's another word in that sentence. It's not just relative. It's everything. So what does he mean by everything? Well, that's easy. Everything means everything. What's so hard about that? Well, wait a minute. If everything in that sentence means everything, isn't the sentence everything's relative part of everything? Which would then make the sentence what? Also relative. Okay, so now that's what I call the suicide tactic, the self-refuting element of that statement coming into play. But notice I was able to kind of tease out the idea that this is self-refuting simply by asking two questions. I never said it was self-refuting. I mean, I'm asking the question. This is what follows from what you just said. Help me understand this, okay? And there are lots and lots and lots of occasions here that are like that. There's another detail here, though, that I wanted to make clear about the value of getting street smart, because you can actually enlist your objector as an aid in answering the questions. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So background information, existence of God, one of the best evidences for the existence of God is the fact that the universe came into existence at some time in the past. Okay, some people call it the Big Bang, and I know a lot of Christians are uncomfortable with that. Keep in mind, both Christians and non-Christians agree that the universe had a beginning.
Right.
Doesn't matter what you call it. We all believe it has an absolute beginning. So, okay, that we can use that. So in my questions, I'll ask of an atheist who, and this has happened before, University of Toronto, it happened to be in a Q&A, for example. What's the evidence for God? I said, do you mind if I ask some questions? No. go ahead. Okay, these are easy at first, but do you think that things exist? Yeah, things exist. This microphone in front of me existed. The student said there at the university. Okay, well, I can work with that. The things that exist now, did they always exist? That's the second question. No, they didn't always exist. So they came into existence at a point in time. Notice I know they believe in the origin of the universe, but I don't want to assume it. I want them to say it. That's what I'm after. Conversation. Okay, great. I agree with both things. Things exist and they didn't always exist. Okay, now here's my third question, and this is the one that matters. What caused everything that exists to come into existence? And I'll make it easy on you. There are only two options. Either something or no thing. Easy. So what say you? Now, of course, the atheist at this point doesn't want to say something because that's something outside of the material universe, which he doesn't believe in. Okay, and that's something that would have to be pretty powerful and pretty smart, and a person to initiate the causal chain, as philosophers will say, to start things happening. Okay, doesn't want to go there, but he's only got one alternative, and that one alternative is no thing caused everything for no reason.
Right.
Now, maybe that's possible, but it isn't the odds-on favorite. And that's the point I'm getting to, you know. For gals who come home and see a new Mercedes SL in the garage and they say, honey, where did that new Mercedes come from in the garage? Oh, darling, it just popped into existence out of nothing. I mean, that's the way the universe, you know, they're not going to buy that because it's not the odds-on favorite. But notice what happened. Because I was asking the preliminary questions, I was getting, the objector was helping me by placing the pieces on the table, the stepping stones that I needed to get to my final question that mattered. Had I just tried to place them before him with statements, he could easily begin to gainsay each one. Oh, no. Maybe we're butterfly streaming, or maybe blah, blah, this and that. You know, they don't want to follow you. So instead, when you ask the question that has a common sense response, they give the common sense response. They're not going to take something off the table that they put onto the table. And every one of my dialogues is like that. Every single one. Give me a piece, give me a piece, give me a piece. The reason that this is doable is because the answers that we give about these issues are good ones. That's key. They're good ones. This isn't sophistry. This isn't manipulation. We have very good answers, but sometimes it takes a few steps to get there. So how do we take the steps? We use a question to get the other person to put the piece on the table. And I got lots of examples of that, but there's one.
Oh, that's great. That's so good. Very, very helpful, practical. We're talking to Greg Koukl, whose new book, Street Smarts, is a fantastic step 2 in the series that he's written. Tactics is the first book. Street Smarts is the second book, focusing on how to use questions to communicate truth to people. Greg, it occurs to me, first of all, that asking questions is powerful because in an age when most people just want to shut conversation down, you're focusing on opening it up.
That's right. And that's a very good observation. There's so many values to using questions. I used to give like 2 examples, but I've thought of a whole bunch more. First of all, it buys you time. You get hit with something, or you're entering into a kind of spiritual conversation. You don't know where to go. Okay, you ask a question, and the ball's not in your court anymore. It's in the other court. When you ask a question and the ball goes in the other court, that initiates a conversation. Okay, and that conversation then gives you valuable information. That's the third thing. People think, you mean I should be asking the atheist about his own view and have him tell me more reasons or details about? Yes, of course, because not only do you want to understand their view, and the more that they talk about it, the more remember, these are false views. The more they talk about it, the bigger the hole is that they're digging for themselves. That's the way it works out. And you also want them to understand their own view too. Okay, and lots of times they are not required to articulate their view in any detail or give any solid reasons why they think their view is true. When we ask those 2 questions, those are the first 2 questions of the game plan, that forces them to think more about it. And it's amazing. I got stories in Street Smarts. I added these in, accounts of how just using one question, asking for clarification of a waitress's view that in Seattle is, so it's in the 2nd chapter, I think, how it got her thinking. And she said that nobody's ever asked questions about my view before. And it got me thinking, because she didn't have a good answer to the questions I asked, okay? I wasn't trying to embarrass her, but I was trying to get her thinking, which is exactly what happened. So there's a couple of things that are good about questions. Here's another one. When you're using questions, you're in the driver's seat of the conversation, okay? Just take our conversation here, for example, okay? I'm doing all the heavy lifting here, Jeff. I'm doing all the talking.
This is what I love about my show is I just get to sit and learn and then put it out there for other people to learn.
But the thing is, you are in the driver's seat of this conversation, even though I'm doing the talking, because of the questions you're asking me, they're directing the conversation in a particular way. And so when the Christian knows the questions to ask, they can stay in the driver's seat of the conversation and move the conversation in the direction they want. Now, that is the point of street smarts. When somebody has street smarts, they know the problems with the view, take abortion, they know the core issue, they know the problems, and they know the questions to ask to get step by step by step, with the other person's help, to the solution. And then just leave it there for them to think about. They don't have to be a card-carrying pro-lifer when you're done. You just want to put stones in their shoes so they think about the issue in a way they never have before.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what these questions will help them to do.
Well, a good question has so much value. Good questions keep on asking long after the conversation is over, because people tend to ruminate, especially if the conversation surprises them,
Yes.
which it will if you're asking questions instead of trying to avoid it, or just come to some sort of an artificial agreement. Oh, we just have to agree to disagree. Or dismissing it, which, that statement, everything is relative, that's not intended to further a conversation. That's intended to dismiss all possible
Exactly
conversation.
Right. That's exactly right.
So in an age where, ironically, I think as a Christian, I have been told, especially when I was in school, that I was closed-minded. It turns out that believers are now the open-minded ones in these situations, to the degree that they can assume biblical truth. We do live in a world in which Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And therefore, among other things, logic works, and we can make sense of things. We don't have to use that always to just say, to tell. We can use it to ask. So yeah, this is really powerful. I think it's certainly leaving me thinking, Greg, and a lot of other people, and so grateful for the work that you've done in this book.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned open-minded too, because I want to add a dimension to that. A closed-minded person is the person who has blinders on, right? Like the horse, and they don't look to the right or to the left. They see their view, and they don't want to be confused. I've got this little, let me show you this little monkey thing here, right?
See no evil,
great.
Hear no evil.
Yeah, but it's this one, I put the monkeys because of the evolution issue. I got this, and that's what I thought of. And it's like, this is closed-mindedness. And see no facts, see no evidence. No, hear no, speak no. Leave me alone with my beliefs. But a Christian doesn't have to be that way. There are Christians that are like that, but they don't have to be. I can be completely open to consider the merits of other views, because I know how to think about those issues. I know where the pitfalls are in those issues, and I understand the good reasons that we have for Christianity. So these other things don't scare me. I don't have to be so frightened about hearing something that I've got to close my mind to other options. Usually it's the other side that is closed-minded, and they talk to themselves a lot, and that's why when you have someone bring up an issue that they've not heard before, forces them to think about their own view in a more critical fashion. They don't know what to do. I call this, by the way, and here's a 60s alert. I don't know if you're old enough to appreciate these guys, but the Simon and Garfunkel moment. I don't remember those guys. They were great musicians back in the day. They're still alive, but they're really old. But they wrote a song in 1966 titled "The Sounds of Silence." And that's what you get when you encounter someone on the other side and you ask the right kind of questions that are appropriate of their view. Crickets. Do you hear that?
Yep.
It's like, what? They've never really had to do that before. And what I've seen is people will come into a conversation with their sails filled with their bluster and with their ideas and with their ego, right? And then I ask a question regarding the claims they're making, and the wind goes right out of their sails. They don't know. I'm not trying to embarrass them. I'm just trying to get clarity on the view that they're promoting. And so this is kind of what we're after. We want people. It's not a gotcha moment in the sense that most people think of that. It's not like mic drop. It's not a gladiator moment. And this is the way a lot of these conversations happen to be. Who can draw first blood and most blood? You know, and that's one reason that Christians are not engaging, because they don't want to get involved in that. You start asking questions, though, and listening and paying attention, and then knowing the right questions to ask depending on what comes out from the other person. That's all the street smarts. Then it's going to be a very different kind of encounter than you've experienced before.
Yeah, this is so good. Yeah, well, we're not after trying to dunk on people. We're trying to move people toward the truth, just as the Apostle Paul said to Timothy, perhaps God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth. Then they may come to their senses and escape the trap of the devil who's taken them captive to do his will.
Come to their senses, you know. There's so much about what we believe to be true, what we're convinced is true, actually comports with common sense. Yeah. When my 8-year-old, and this is why I deal with the atheist issue, I talk about when my daughter was 8, and she asked me, Papa, how do we know that God is true? You know, she already had the content, but now she's asking for some reasons. And I thought about it for a moment, and then I said something, and I realized this really captures my whole approach to this project. And I said, honey, the reason that we know that God is true is because he's the best explanation for the way things are. He's the best explanation for the way things are, whether it's the beginning of the universe or the design of the universe or the moral project that we're all involved with in the world, or the problem of evil, or a whole host of other things. This one answers the questions that are deep and profound, and we don't have to be frightened of that. Yeah. It's the other side that doesn't have the answers.
Yeah. Man, this is so good. Greg, listen, you've been on the show twice now. Both conversations have been really eye-opening, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody. Get that book, Street Smarts. It's available by the time you hear this, and you can pick that book up. Let me know what you think about it. Of course, you can always email me, and jeff@summit.org, and let me know what you think. And then we'll just keep the conversation going, and maybe I'll even be able to ask you a question or two. Greg, thanks so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, listen, kudos to you and the whole team over there for 60 years now or so, longer, I guess. 52? Is that when it was you guys started?
62 years. I was not here, but I have it on good authority that it's 62 years.
Oh, it was 1962. Now I get it. Okay. But anyway, I was around in 62, but that was the year that, I was in junior high. In any event, I'm glad to always partner with you, Jeff. Good work.
Thanks, man. Thank you to my guest today, Greg Koukl, for coming on the show, and thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoy the show, would you consider leaving a review on your favorite platform? These reviews actually help people find the show. And the Dr. Jeff Show is a resource of Summit Ministries, which equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and to champion a biblical worldview. So, if you want more resources that will help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, or parent, summit.org/resources is the place to go. If you're curious, there are videos by Greg Koukl on the site, as well as ebooks, articles, all kinds of things. So Stand to Reason, that's the ministry that Greg has. The new book is called Street Smarts. Read it. Let me know what you think, because I think he's really onto something. Asking questions is really important, right? Have a good week. Hey, are you looking for more great podcasts that can help build your faith and give you inspiration? Our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. You download it at edify.app or search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store. Spell Edify, E-D-I-F-I.